Thank you, Jerome. And I apologize for this. I don't normally read a paper, but I'm going to do that today. I made the very bad decision to move from being a Mac user to an Apple user last week, and it's completely destroyed my intellectual life for the next 6 months while I cope with this change. I haven't been coping with it very well at all, and I haven't been able to put together a proper presentation. There are a few slides which I hope are going to work. I think they're probably not in the right order, but we can probably deal with that. Anyway, so, somebody will have to give me 5 minutes warning when I'm supposed to go for about 40 minutes, aren't I? Yes. Right, very clearly indicate to me. Okay, good. So, so here's a quotation from David Rosand, the art historian, which I sort of was struck by. Must we dissociate the mimetic impulse of the stroke from its self-expression? Or can we, in fact, legitimately claim meaning for the brushwork itself? That is, for the art itself. To put it another way, is there a meaning initiating in the artist, a meaning that may itself be mediated by the imitated subject matter, but that resides essentially in the visible traces of the painter's gesture, a meaning in which we hear his own voice? Well, I wouldn't have put it exactly that way myself. Slightly, certain amount of rhetoric in that, and I'm not. If we had to analyze it word by word, I'm not sure I'd be able to know quite what to say. But in spirit, at least, this can serve pretty well as a motto for this talk. And I'll come back to him in a moment. So marks on a surface are capable of having a complex and very special interest for us when they are depictive marks. Such marks may point in two directions: forward to the scene depicted and backward to the activity of the artist. They're both depictive marks and traces of intentional activity with, as Rosand says, an affective as well as a mimetic or representational function. So I want to contrast different kinds of pictures, pictures which have both those features in significant ways and pictures which don't. And I'm interested in the different ways those kinds of pictures are experienced. Now, one and the same picture may be experienced in many different ways. A picture can be experienced in ways which are ill-informed or which reflect inattention. The differences that I'm interested in here are differences between the kinds of experience the pictures merit, or which are appropriate to the kinds of pictures they are. There is, it seems to me, there are aspects to one's experience of a picture that are appropriate or inappropriate given the kind of picture it is, though it's certainly not the case that there's just one total experience that is appropriate for any given picture. I'm concerned here only with depictive pictures, pictures which represent and do so in depictive ways. I won't define depiction here. I take it that we at least have an intuitive understanding of what a depiction is. So in painting and drawing, we put marks on a surface, and the result is, if everything goes well, a depictive representation. The marks are the physical, but not the metaphysical basis of the representation. With no marks, there would be no representation. But we need more than the marks, for the representation doesn't supervene on the totality of marks. This very totality of marks might have represented something else, not Smith, but Twin Smith, not the Mount Everest, but Mount Twin Everest, so on. Perhaps we can say that the marks collectively constitute the representation, but then constitution is a contingent relation. Marks which constitute one thing in one context, one possible world, one might think of it as being, constitute something else in another. I won't go on. I say a bit more about how this relation between marks and what is represented turns out to be very weak, but I don't think I actually need to really say that for the purposes of this paper, and I'm a bit worried about time, so I will leave that out. For all the weakness of the metaphysical relation between marks and representation, the marks constitute much of what is of interest in the representation. Many things that would not interest us if we saw them interest us as represented because of the way the marks constitute the representation. Wollheim says that a precondition for this sort of interest in representation is what he calls twofoldness, the capacity we have to attend simultaneously to what is represented in the picture and to the marks which constitute the representation. We see how it is that the marks constitute the representation. We may, as Wollheim says, marvel at the skill and imagination exercised in achieving this representational effect with these marks. Now, not all the marks visible on a surface need contribute to the representation. Dom Lopes has made a distinction between design and surface. We can also make a distinction between design marks and surface marks. The paper may have a visible grain, which allows us to see a range of marks which are not design marks because they're not depiction supporting. They are not marks put on the paper in the process of constructing the representation. And design marks can vary very greatly in their salience. Some marks are thickly impasted. Others have no obvious depth. Some marks are very clearly distinguished from others, while others have indeterminate boundaries between them. And marks may be worked together to produce smooth areas of colour, with the surface of the whole approximating the condition of a conventionally well-taken photograph. So let's focus for a moment on such a picture. In such a picture there are, so far as design marks go, no variations in colour, texture or grain other than those which correspond to variations in what is represented. In such a case, each surface mark is ascribable directly to the object represented, and a change of shade in the colour is a fold in the dress, say. A boundary between colour patches is a boundary between colours in the person's costume. Such a picture I will call a coincident picture. There's a complete coincidence between variation in the marked surface and variation in the depicted features of the represented scene. Perhaps only a few pictures are wholly or absolutely coincident. Perhaps none are. But many pictures approximate that condition, or have significant parts which do so, or seem to be intended to approximate it, or approximate it for certain viewers in certain conditions. In the case of a coincident painting, do we have twofoldness? We can see the colour patches as colour patches, and we can see them as, say, a dress. Can we see them as both at the same time, which is what I take as is required for twofoldness in Wollheim's sense? I confess I don't have a good enough grasp on what this experience of twofoldness would be like to be confident about whether I'm having these sorts of experiences or not when I look at coincident pictures. I would only say this, that it's obvious, once your attention is drawn to it, that we can in some cases attend simultaneously to surface marks and to what is represented in the case where there's lack of coincidence, it's, to me, not obvious that we can do that in the case of coincident pictures. What you can, of course, do in the case of a coincident picture is attend simultaneously to the represented object and to the absence of non-coincident marks. And where there is coincidence, you can shift between seeing the patch as a patch of paint and seeing it as, say, a dress. Those two things together mean that surface marks, even in the case of a fully coincident picture, are or may be aesthetically important. One's judgment about the kind of picture this is and the kind of artistic and aesthetic achievement it represents depends partly on noticing, attending to, and understanding the relation between the pattern of marks and what is represented, and that's possible even without twofoldness. One may approve or disapprove of the artistic choice of coincidence for this picture, or think that some part of the picture might usefully have deviated from coincidence, or admire the way in which the effect of coincidence has been achieved, perhaps with difficult materials. I want to come on to talk about photographs because I've been talking about paintings and drawings so far, but I want to introduce at this point the idea of a trace, which I mentioned earlier on. I say that marks on paper, or some of them, are traces of intentional activity. But I mean this in a somewhat restricted and perhaps artificial sense. The best examples of marks which are traces are marks like these. Perhaps I'm not quite there yet. Okay, so this is a detail from Titian, it's a late Titian, The Rape of Europa, and it's a detail of the picture that Rosanne draws attention to in the article from which I quoted earlier on. So here we have examples of marks which are, in my sense, traces. They are marks which carry information in a certain way concerning the activity of the agent who produced them. Thus, marks like these correspond to, say, a single flowing movement of the arm and brush, or sometimes the finger, which I think Titian used sometimes, or an act of dappling the paint on the surface, which enables the viewer to reconstruct spontaneously and in imagination the action which produced them. They enable us to recapitulate that movement in imagination, which we usually do spontaneously and without much consciousness of doing so, though I think we can bring this imagining under the spotlight of consciousness. The imaginings at issue here are motor imaginings, imagined movements that we make which correspond, perhaps roughly, to the movements that would have produced those marks. But when a patch of colour is applied with great care, as in a photographic realist painting, those patches won't any longer be traces in my sense. So if I come to his photorealist kind of picture, of course, though the quality of the reproduction doesn't really make that absence, total absence of visible marks very of traces very clear. So when a patch of colour is applied with great care in such a painting as this, the patches of colour won't any longer be traces in my sense. They do carry, I assume, some information about the activity which produced them. They're not traces because they're not apt to enable those imagined reproductions of movement. All this suggests that there's a particularly interesting class of pictures which are non-coincident and where the marks are traces. In such cases, we see the marks both as supporting the representation and as embodying the movements that created them. They're the sort of marks which Rosanne's comment quoted earlier that I gave drew attention to. Such pictures are at one end of a spectrum, the other end of which is occupied by ordinary photographic and cinematic images, to which I now turn. With a photographic positive, we have to distinguish two kinds of marks which are not coincident. There's the paper on which the image is printed, if it is printed on paper, and that paper may have a grain. I guess that could be the case with the screen on which a cinematic image is projected as well, though I guess one tends not to notice such a thing. This, like the texture of the canvas in a painting, is not representation supporting. The marks that the graininess of the paper makes visible don't contribute to the representation. Then there's the graininess of the film stock itself. Thus, a traditional photograph will consist of a mosaic of tiny colour patches which vary in colour or grayness across the image. Those individual marks constitute the representation. To this extent, we have the possibility of twofoldness in photography. We can attend where they are visible to the grain of the stock and see how those marks or subsets of them support the representational configuration of the picture. In cinema, this grain is not usually visible under normal viewing conditions. But in a scene from Ingmar Bergman's film A Passion, I don't have the scene, but I do have some images from it. So this is a long take of about a couple of minutes of a man walking back and forward. It looks like a zoom. It's not. The shot was progressively blown up. And as the shot gets enlarged, the graininess of the image becomes more and more visible until the point where you cannot any longer distinguish representational features of the image there at all. So here we have a case where the blowing up of the shot makes the grain of the film stock more and more evident to the point where one can no longer identify representational elements in the scene. And one of the disturbing aspects of this is that the image itself seems to break up as more and more of the detail of the supporting system of marks becomes visible. The image decomposes into its non-depictive parts, providing a vivid visual parallel to the psychological disintegration of the man represented in the image. Now, that would not be the effect achieved in the case where, with a still photograph, the grain of the photographic paper was very evident, though the grain of the film stock was not, or if somehow the grain of the cinema projection screen became increasingly visible during the length of the shot. In cinema and photography, the grain of the film stock has an intimate relationship to the representational features of the picture. The grain of the paper does not. But in the case of photography and cinema, this relationship between representational features and the depiction constituting marks of the film stock has, for all its intimacy, a rather limited artistic interest for us. We do not see this relation as one which is the result of a complex series of detailed choices made by the artist. With a painting, the artist puts a mark on the canvas and then another mark, and so on, each decision about line or colour guided partly by the aim of producing a certain representational effect, though of course that's not the only aim. The series of marks is the record of those choices, and we may, on the basis of the visible result, assess and enjoy the results as successful or deplore them as unsuccessful. But it's not through a series of such choices that photographs are made. If the grain of the photograph is not intended to be visible, then no aesthetic purpose is served by attending to it, any more than there would be an aesthetic point to examining a painting under a microscope to see the specks of colour in suspension. If the grain of the photograph is intended to be visible, We may attend to it and admire or deplore the effect, but it will not have for us the rich interest that the sequence of marks on the surface of a painting has, because it fails to be a trace of the artist's activity. It is instead merely a result of those choices. The artist may exploit those marks for aesthetic ends, but in so doing, she's taking advantage of the materials with which she works, not something that she has accomplished. While the grain of the film stock is occasionally evident in photographs and cinematic images, like the ones we've just been looking at, the norm is for grain to be invisible or discernible only with great difficulty. Now, one may be aware in the case of an image of either of these two kinds, photos and cinematic images, that the grain is not visible. An awareness of this may be part of what drives one's aesthetic judgment about the image. In some circumstances, one might regard the lack of grain as an aesthetic or artistic achievement, or one might feel that here an opportunity to use grainy stock was lost, and that the result is less good than it might otherwise have been. But in cases like this, there's a significant difference between a painting and a photograph. In the case of the photograph-like painting, one may still attend to the way in which the patches of paint support the depictive properties of the picture. One may think of this as impressively skillful, or perhaps as disappointingly bland. But either way, one is attending to the way in which the patches of paint constitute the representation. And there are pictures which are partly coincident, and one may take note of and enjoy or deplore the artist's choices about which areas to treat in which ways. So with a painting, the marks on the surface, whether coincident or not, whether traces or not, are of aesthetic interest, and we stand ready to attend to them. But with cinema, there are two features which discourage attention to the surface. The first is the general lack of interest in the relation between surface marks and the thing depicted, which I've already mentioned. In all but a vanishingly small proportion of cases, this relation is one of coincidence, and where there's coincidence in the cinematic case, there's nothing noteworthy or aesthetically informative about it because it's achieved automatically. Of course, I mean by this that it's achieved automatically once certain technical decisions are made and implemented, and in a sense, it's remarkable that such decisions can be made and implemented because the technology which allows them is non-trivial, and no doubt making and implementing them requires skill. But those technologies, decisions and skills are simply standard for the film industry. They don't constitute reasons to think well of any particular film, and any more than the availability of oil paint is a reason for thinking well of any particular oil painting. The marks we see on the surface of a cinema screen are not traces of activity in my sense. They don't generate aesthetically charged experiences of simulated movement, and they are not records of aesthetically relevant decisions made by the artist. That is, attending to those marks as marks on a surface tells us nothing about the relevant choices not available to us by attending to the represented people and objects visible in the film image. Now, the reason just given for the irrelevance of the screen surface to the aesthetics of film is a normative reason. Attention to that surface plays no role in an appropriate aesthetic project concerning film. The second reason I want to draw attention to is purely descriptive. It's to do with movement in film. I said that I'm not sure whether, in the case of coincident pictures such as we typically have with film, we are capable of twofoldness in our experience of the screen image. Perhaps we are. We can, surely, move back and forth between attending to the surface patches on the screen and to the represented persons and objects. It's possible. But this is made very difficult for us in the case of a film image by the fact that people and things represented often move, either moving their positions or changing their spatial dispositions, changing the spatial dispositions of their parts. And when things move, we attend to what moves, namely people and objects. Static images impose less of a cognitive load on us, allowing easier shifting of attention between objects and colour patches. Represented movement of objects makes that distribution of attention harder. And that's one difference between photographs, still photographs, and moving images. So what are the consequences of this for the aesthetics of cinema? One way this is helpful is that it enables us to see one possible reason why an otherwise implausible theory has been advocated, namely the view that photography and, I think, cinematography by inference are not arts because the aesthetic interest of a photograph or cinematic image is exhausted by the aesthetic interest of the object photographed. Associate that view with Roger Scruton. I think we're probably clear, Dom again has helped us out here, that that's a false claim. But this much I think is true, that whatever is of interest in a photograph, which is not an interest in the thing represented, does not include, as it does so importantly in painting, an interest in the way in which the representational marks made in a painting support the representational properties of the painting. That is such an important aspect of the aesthetics of pictures that one might understand the attractions of the thought that without that, the aesthetics of pictures would be a null topic, while recognizing on reflection that this isn't true. Secondly, we can now identify a certain aspect of seeing photographs and cinematic images, which is standard for such experiences of seeing and which we might call experienced transparency. Now, transparency is already a term with an established use in discussions of photography, which I'd better just remind you of. A picture is transparent in this sense if, and only if, in seeing what the picture represents, one sees that very thing. So when I see a photograph of my Uncle Albert, I am literally seeing my Uncle Albert. That's what has to be the case for that photograph to be transparent. Kendall Walton has argued that photographs are transparent, but paintings and drawings are not. Now, reactions to that idea have tended to be of two kinds. One is to deny that photographs are transparent, and that's a view I've argued myself some time ago. The other reaction has been to argue that all depictions are transparent. Dom has argued for that position. Both those views deny that transparency constitutes any kind of difference between photographs and other kinds of depictions. But holders of both those views might want to argue that there is a difference between photographs and other kinds of depictions, a difference which encourages, without establishing, the view that they are distinguished by the transparency of photographs and the non-transparency of handmade images. What I'm suggesting is that there is such a difference and that it is what I'm calling experienced transparency. By that I mean the fact that with handmade images, the marked surface has a salience which it does not have in photography. This is not a matter of, at least not merely a matter of, the fact that photographs are standardly coincident pictures, while paintings are often not, and perhaps drawings never are. For a painting may be coincident without, in my terms, coming to be a picture with experienced transparency. What matters is not so much whether the picture is coincident, but whether its coincidence is a salient feature of it. Where photographs are coincident, as they usually are, their being so is not a salient fact about them, for coincidence has not been achieved by any aesthetically relevant process. But if a painting is coincident, that's because the artist has made the decision to make it so and has gone to the trouble of implementing that decision, and that implementation requires aesthetic work. So the relevant fact here is that the photographic medium is one which standardly produces coincident pictures, the coincidence of which is not an object of aesthetic attention. That combination of features I'll call the recessiveness of the medium. We might get a better sense of what recessiveness amounts to by comparing the recessiveness of standard cinematic method with animation films. An animation film may be done with a great deal of skill and constitute, perhaps approximately, a coincident picture or sequence of such pictures. But its coincidence will be aesthetically salient. In appreciating the animation aesthetically, one should notice the way in which colour patches have been applied to a surface, skillfully, appropriately, or not. The standard film and the animation may be the same in coincidence, but different in the salience of coincidence, and hence different in respect of recessiveness, when compared to the medium of painting. There's a feature of the medium to which one naturally and appropriately attends when looking at a painting or drawing that one does not attend to when looking at a photograph, and so one's attention is not focused on the image surface in the case of the photograph or cinematic image, though it may be focused on other aspects of the medium. Now, those other aspects of the medium are not all to do with the surface itself, but to do with the way in which the scene has been arranged or left to arrange itself, how the camera's been focused, what the lighting is like. Those are features we can attend to while thinking about the scene itself and how the objects were disposed in that scene. We don't need to think about the surface in the way that we think about it in the case of a painting. So as a result, we may have a feeling of seeing the scene itself rather than a representation of it, which is what I'm calling experienced transparency. Now, experienced transparency is not transparency in Walton's sense, but one might find transparency an attractive idea because, or partly because, if things, in general, if things are as if something is true, then we're often tempted, and sometimes have reason, to think that that thing is true. Indeed, often the best argument we have for thinking that something is true is that it seems to be true. Now, perhaps the issue here is slightly more difficult because experienced transparency, as I've described it, might not be the same as it seeming to us that transparency is true. Perhaps all that can be said is that experienced transparency, in my sense, encourages us to feel that transparency is true. What finally about those cases where we have coincidence, yet certain patches on a cinematic image or photographic image are seen to form and seem intended to be seen as forming abstract patterns, as occurs so often with expressionist filmmaking? So this is a kind of typically film noir shot from the late 40s. Are these cases ones where we're encouraged to attend to the marks on the surface as marks on the surface rather than as transparent to the scene? Perhaps that occasionally happens, but on the whole it strikes me that what's going on in such cases is that we're encouraged to see the pattern as existing within the depicted scene as something visible within that scene from a certain point of view, namely the point of view of the camera, and constituted by things within that scene, such as the pattern of light created by a window blind or the narrow pool of light created by a lamp. It's probably true that the flatness of the screen enables us to see those patterns in a way that we would not if we were there in the scene. But that seems to be a matter of how awareness of the screen inflects how we see things within the scene, and not a matter of seeing them as patterns on the screen itself. Thank you.